In May of 1862, the Army of the Potomac had advanced up the peninsula from their base of operations at Fort Monroe to the gates of Richmond. Standing in their way was an unassuming barrier, a shallow, swamp-ridden, slow-moving river known as the Chickahominy. Named after one of the tribes of the Powhatan Confederacy centuries prior, this river would prove to be an impediment to the Army of the Potomac, and a golden opportunity to Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia in the coming months. In an attempt to alleviate the issues associated with it, the Army of the Potomac would have to rely on the numerous fords, causeways, and crossings over the river to keep the Army linked together. In this video, we'll be examining the photographs of 3 of these critical crossings over the river, analyzing the small details, and exploring the importance of these humble wooden bridges that would play a critical role during the spring and summer of 1862. The Chickahominy River is one of a number of tributaries that feed into the James River. If one were to look at any map of central Virginia, this river would appear to be nothing more than a minor setback for any army assaulting the city of Richmond. However, looks can be deceiving. The Chickahominy is in a unique position because any army approaching the city of Richmond from either the north or the east would have to cross over the river. This would appear simple enough. But there is one other crucial detail about this river that maps of the time often did not indicate. The river has a vast floodplain dominated by marshes and swamps. Instead of having a singular channel like the James, the river fans out into multiple channels which feed the marshes, extending them across the entirety of the floodplain. The floodplains are further extended across the entirety of the Chickahominy River Valley, with tributaries to it, such as White Oak Creek and Boatswain Creek, being dominated by the same swamps and marshland. As a result, there are only a few points in which the river can be crossed, often requiring the construction of multiple bridges to cross over the various channels and a considerable amount of dirt and debris to build a causeway. The first of these crossings we'll be examining is the Mechanicsville Turnpike Causeway, specifically the northernmost bridge. This photograph was captured by a photographer we've discussed several times in the past, John Reiki. The photograph, a part of the Alexander Gardner collection, was taken on April 15, 1865, just days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse and less than 2 weeks after the fall of Richmond. Both photographs of the bridge are aligned facing north towards the heights where the town of Mechanicsville is situated. In the first photograph, the camera is aligned towards the northeast. 2 men are visible. One is sitting down on the bridge, while another man is leaning against a dirt embankment. This embankment extends for a considerable distance until it's out of shot. This embankment, which is slightly higher than the nearby dirt causeway, is likely a flood barrier, designed and built specifically for protecting the causeway from erosion during major floods. This would make sense as the causeway itself is only about 4 or 5 feet above the river's water level. The low height of these embankments will be a common trend with all of the major crossings over the Chickahominy, which will help explain the numerous issues the Army of the Potomac had during May and June of 1862. The bridge, as can be seen here, is made out of cut and shaped timber beams, which are supported by large, thick, square timber posts embedded into the soft soil of the river. The timber beams are embedded in the causeway embankment, which helped support the roadbed. What's more important to note is that this is not the only bridge crossing at this point. Just behind this bridge is another bridge, one that is slightly angled upward in the center with logs nailed in on either side. It, too, is made from timbers that have been shaped. More importantly, the width between the timber posts supporting the bridge is narrower than the adjacent bridge. The second bridge is likely a pedestrian bridge. a bridge designed specifically for foot traffic. The reasoning behind having these two bridges is relatively simple. The wider bridge can be used for carriage and wagon traffic, while the smaller bridge can be used for foot traffic, allowing for people to walk along the causeway and cross the bridge without the risk of impeding wagons trying to cross at the same time. In the background, we can see trees lining the flat plain. These trees denote where the marshland and swamps reside, thus making it more difficult to cut them down for their wood. However, several trees were cleared nearby the bridge, as evidenced by a number of stumps that can be seen in the foreground. It's also in the foreground that we can see the river branching off. According to this wartime map, this branched off into a secondary channel, which required its own bridge crossing. From here, we shift our perspective to face towards the northwest. The shift in perspective allows for us to see the true length of the bridges. Both the pedestrian and wagon bridges required 3 sets of supports to properly span this section of the river. What's more interesting is we can see the construction of the pedestrian bridge. Just poking out of the waterline is a large timber, which binds the 2 center timber posts together. In addition, we can see a relatively thick board nailed into the supports, linking the pedestrian bridge's central support posts to the wagon bridge. This likely indicates that the central support posts are not deeply embedded into the underlying sediment. In the background, we can see farmland along the northern embankment of the Chickahominy. These heights are located just west of the town of Mechanicsville and rise well over 100 feet above the Chickahominy River. Focusing back towards the bridge, we can see 3 men in this photograph. The man standing on the far left is likely the same man observed leaning against the dirt embankment in the prior photograph. The second man sitting down is the same man seen sitting down on the bridge from earlier. This time, we have a much clearer view of him and his equipment. He's wearing horse riding boots and the typical uniform associated with federal cavalry. Sitting on his lap is a short rifle, likely a Spencer carbine, which had become standard among the federal cavalry by 1865. The third man is squatting down next to the river, looking down at the water. This man, with his full beard and dark-colored vest, is most likely John Reiki himself, as the same man, wearing the same clothing with the same facial hair, can also be seen in another photograph attributed to Reiki. The iconic photograph of Oakwood Cemetery, which we'd previously covered in this series. Finally, off to the far right, we have a cart and a set of horses standing nearby. This cart is likely that of John Reiki's photography team, which would have carried all of the items necessary to develop any photo negatives taken out in the field, including the very photographs we've looked at so far. But why would Reiki take the time to take photographs of this unassuming bridge? The answer to that is simple. Reiki was likely tasked with taking photographs of the locations central to the 7 Days battles. This bridge is critical with the opening moments of Lee's grand counterattack, which would upend the entire Peninsula campaign. On June 26, 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia had been mobilized. Robert E. Lee, along with Jefferson Davis, were situated atop a bluff on the southern bank of the Chickahominy. Nearby, D.H. Hill's division and James Longstreet's division were waiting in the growing summer heat for their signal to advance across the Chickahominy. Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson's forces were supposed to advance from the north towards Mechanicsville and assault the right flank of Fitz-John Porter's 5th Corps. However, Jackson had been uncharacteristically late. After having fought for several months straight in the valley, he and his men were exhausted. They had been slow to move and were well over 6 hours behind schedule. Advancing along Jackson's right, along the northern bank of the Chickahominy, was Brigadier General Lawrence Branch's brigade of North Carolinians, which had been detached from A.P. Hill's division. They had been tasked with crossing the Chickahominy at half sink, several miles further upstream from Lee's position, and establishing contact with Jackson's forces. From there, they were to inform Lee of Jackson's approach, which would allow for Lee to advance the rest of his forces. Less than a mile to the west of the Mechanicsville Turnpike, A.P. Hill's division was waiting for the signal to cross. They had assembled nearby Meadow Bridge and would have been the first forces to have been informed of Branch's contact with Jackson's forces. However, Branch had failed to issue such a signal. Hill, being a man of action, had grown impatient and, in the afternoon, crossed the Chickahominy and began to engage the pickets of Porter's 5th Corps. Much debate has surrounded these events, though the lack of any reprimand from Lee to Hill, and testimony of Lee having drafted an order for Hill to advance, indicates that these actions were necessary. Upon hearing the firing of guns across the river, Lee would have D.H. Hill's division advance up the Mechanicsville Turnpike across the Chickahominy. Brigadier General Roswell S. Ripley's brigade of Georgians and North Carolinians were the first to cross the river. It was over this very bridge, which had been damaged in an attempt to prevent such a crossing, that D.H. Hill's division, James Longstreet's division, and Robert E. Lee's staff would cross over the river and assault the 5th Corps, marking the beginning of Lee's counteroffensive. From here, we begin moving down the river. Utilizing the Confederate map, we can see a number of bridges, many of which are marked as being destroyed. All of these bridges served the key role of linking the isolated 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac with the rest of the Army located further to the south. Of these bridges, only one has been photographed as they had appeared during the time between June 1st and June 27th of 1862. The first photograph we'll be examining was taken by another photographer who is best known for his photographs of Savage's Station, James F. Gibson. The photograph, unlike many others, has an informative description. Military bridge across the Chickahominy, built by the 15th New York Volunteers under Colonel John McLeod Murphy. From a casual glance, you can identify that this bridge, unlike the prior Mechanicsville Turnpike bridges, is hastily constructed. Bark is visible on many of the support posts, the timbers holding it together are much thinner, and the ends of the timbers show clear signs of having been hewn by an axe. Unlike the prior bridges, this bridge was hastily constructed and sourced from the nearby woods, and was hastily put together to satisfy the needs of the Army of the Potomac. In the top left corner of the photograph, a wooden sign, which is nailed to the tree, is visible. This sign likely would have had information to indicate where the various camps were on either side of the river, or, alternatively, would have had the name of the bridge posted. In the background, we can see a young man kneeling down, which can help us understand the true length of the bridge. With a closer examination, we can see the roadway of the bridge continues on for a considerable distance. What appears to be a wooden berm wall is, in fact, a centrally stacked wooden support column, made by stacking large wooden logs in a similar fashion to Lincoln logs. This is likely done to provide additional support for the bridge's road structure, especially the large number of supply wagons, artillery pieces, and troops that would be crossing this bridge. Another photographer, David B. Woodbury, would take a photograph of the same bridge, but from an entirely different angle. This photograph is often recycled and used as a stand-in for various bridges in the area during the war by the National Park Service. In this photograph, we're treated with something rather interesting. We see a group of uniformed men standing atop of the bridge, many holding shovels, with some posing in front of the camera as if they're doing work. One of them is sitting atop one of the wooden beams used to support the central span of the bridge, while another is standing atop of another wooden support beam. This one is precariously placed atop the stump of a tree, which was likely felled to help make the supporting structure. Further off to the rear, we see two horsemen astride their mounts, while, in the far corner, one man is wielding an axe, having cut through a part of the tree to make his pose look more convincing to the keen-eyed observer. All of these men were members of the Engineering Brigade of the Army of the Potomac, some of whom likely worked on this bridge. This photograph further illuminates just how the central span was built. Near the waterline, we can see that one of the supporting beams is in fact a wholly intact tree, which had been felled to provide a foundation for the rest of the stacked logs. The truly rough nature of these bridges would carry on beyond the federal bridges themselves. As we continue our way down the river, we'll encounter our final photographed bridge, the famous Grapevine Bridge. The Grapevine Bridge would become one of the most important bridges over the Chickahominy. The bridge would get its name for one of the most prominent features of the Chickahominy, the many channels that, to the casual observer, looked like the vines of a grape plant. In spite of the meandering nature of the river, this particular crossing would become one of the most vital crossings over the river. Hanover Road, one of the most important north-south routes east of the Mechanicsville Turnpike, crossed the river in this section, a vital route necessary for linking up the northern elements of the Army of the Potomac with the bulk of the army nearby Fair Oaks Station. Prior to the Union's occupation of the crossing, the original bridge crossing over the river had been destroyed, requiring for it to be rebuilt by the Army of the Potomac's Engineering Brigade. Placed in charge of this was the 5th New Hampshire Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Edward E. Cross, who'd recently been attached to the Engineering Brigade. In this photograph, we can see many of the same rough elements visible in the previous bridge crossing. However, unlike the previous examples, we have a good view of the road deck and how it was laid out. The road deck was covered in a layer of mud, dirt, and hay, which had a few purposes. First, the dirt layer prevented damage to the wooden deck of the bridge from constant supply wagon traffic and provided a flat surface to step on. Second, the dirt layer would serve as an optical illusion for the horses and mules that would cross over the bridge. Horses and mules tend to be timid when stepping on a surface that doesn't appear like solid ground. By covering the wooden deck in dirt, it makes the bridge look like terra firma, making them less timid to cross. Third, and finally, the dirt and hay softens any noise coming from men, animals, and wagons crossing over the bridge, making it difficult for the enemy to hear any troop movements. What's more notable about this photograph is we have a much clearer view of the various men standing on the bridge. Upon analyzing them, an interesting correlation can be drawn between this photograph and the prior photograph. Many of the men pictured here can also be seen in the prior photograph. For example, this rotund officer can be seen here near the front of the group of men. These two officers can also be seen here nearby the covered wagon. Several more figures can also be identified in both pictures. What's most interesting is the lead wagon is likely the same wagon that appears in the other photograph. To add more intrigue, this image of the Grapevine Bridge was also taken by David B. Woodbury. The officers that can be seen here are clear enough that I've been able to identify them with a limited degree of certainty. For example, the rotund officer, with his apparent colonel chevrons on his shoulders, large figure, rounded nose, and strong cheekbones, is likely Colonel Charles B. Stewart of the 50th New York Engineering Regiment. This officer, with his long beard, is likely Lieutenant Colonel William H. Peets of the same regiment as Stewart. The well-dressed officer facing directly to the camera is likely Colonel Charles McLeod Murphy of the 15th New York Engineering Regiment. Finally, the officer standing just behind the wagon, who towers over many of the other men, is likely Colonel Edward E. Cross of the 5th New Hampshire Regiment. This suggests an interesting idea. It's likely that Woodbury went to Colonel Stewart and asked for his men to pose for these shots to provide a greater sense of authenticity to the photographs. Colonel Stewart, either out of boredom or a desire to get a bit of attention, agreed, gathering up his fellow officers of the Engineering Brigade and about 24 men to pose for these shots. This would explain why some of these men are posing as if they're working. For example, in the lower right corner of the photograph, we can see one man wielding an axe and holding it up against a tree, which has had a few visible chunks cut out of it. Behind the group of men standing on the bridge, we can see another axe wedged firmly into a tree. As with the other photograph, many of the rank and file are holding shovels, though one stands out with his axe in hand. In the background, we can see several more men gathered around and doing as the other men had previously done. It's also here that we can see that the bridge curves towards the left slightly. This detail is important as it can help us identify that the photograph was, like with many others, taken facing northwards, as the roadway, to this day, takes a slight left banking turn. This bridge would have become one of the most important bridges of the war. On May 31st, 1862, Joseph E. Johnston would launch a counteroffensive against the Union Center nearby the crossroads known as Seven Pines, less than a mile south of Fair Oaks Station. The assault would hit the 3rd and 4th Corps of the Army of the Potomac hard, causing their lines to break. However, what ultimately saved the Corps would be the timely arrival of Edwin Bull Sumner's 2nd Corps, specifically John Sedgwick's division. However, the flaws we've seen visible with these bridges reared their ugly head that day. The causeway leading up to the Grapevine Bridge was wholly submerged, and the bridge itself looked as if it was going to shatter at any moment. However, Sumner, seeing the importance of rushing to the aid of the 3rd and 4th Corps, ordered for John Sedgwick's division and Israel Richardson's division to cross. The men slogged through waist-high water. Horses had been stumbling under the intense flow, and one artillery piece, a battery I of the 1st United States Artillery, was lost in the bog. Miraculously, the bridge held up, allowing for the divisions to cross. Late the next month, these same bridges would prove vital in aiding the 5th Corps' flight from Gaines' Mill. The numerous crossing points enabled for the entire 5th Corps to cross the river quickly, and, upon completing their evacuation, the bridges were burned. These bridges, as seen in these photographs, were no more by June 28, 1862. They, along with countless tons of supplies, would go up in flames. Yet, some of these bridges would be rebuilt by Jackson's forces, though this delayed the Army of Northern Virginia in the pursuit of their foes. Once the armies moved on, the importance of these vital crossings waned. Yet, the memory of these bridges wouldn't be forgotten. These valuable photographs provide for us a window into the period, to help us visualize these all-important crossings and see how they impacted history. Most surprising of all, these photographs give us a limited glimpse of the men in charge of building these bridges, many of whom took pride in their work and the important role they played in the war. Though the original constructions are long gone, their memory still remains, immortalized by monuments and, for some, remaining important thoroughfares to this day. The war may be long gone, yet the memory still remains, and, but for a moment, we can see the world as these men saw it with our own eyes.